Just before the pandemic, Medicago was a company that was really on the cutting edge of biopharmaceuticals. Its secret weapon, plants, and using them like little factories to churn out the key components of vaccines.
Our process really is so different, and that's the one thing everyone remarks about, is they've never seen a company like this, they've never seen anyone who does what we do, and there's just this buzz within the industry about Medicago.
Then COVID hit, and the company saw an opportunity.
A biotech company in Quebec has begun Canada's first human trials for a potential vaccine for COVID-19.
Currently building a large facility in Quebec City that will, when completed, will be able to deliver 1 billion doses on an annual basis.
It was so promising, the Canadian government wanted in. It invested $173 million to give the company a jumpstart to help, build that facility that would eventually churn out COVID vaccines, and to develop homegrown, made-in-Canada vaccine capacity so we wouldn't be, so reliant on other countries. But 2 years later, a major snag that some say the government should have seen coming a mile away. Today, why the Canadian government invested so heavily in a company that just shut down. As a company, Medicago is almost a quarter century old. It started as a simple research partnership between Laval University in Quebec City and Agriculture Canada.
Ce que j'aime beaucoup de Québec, c'est que c'est une petite ville, mais très dynamique. Il y a des théâtres, tout est accessible.
It incorporated as Medicago in 1999, and it was just a few years later it began to work with a very particular type of plant, Nicotiana benthamiana, which will become important later. It's a very close cousin of the tobacco plant, useful because of how easy it is to infect with viruses.
What do you see when you look at a plant? We see the potential to help protect human health through the power of vaccines.
Now, Medicago would go on to start production of an H1N1 swine flu vaccine in 2009. Eventually, they delivered millions of doses. It opened a manufacturing plant down south in North Carolina in 2011, even contributed directly to the fight against Ebola, producing on a large scale anti-Ebola monoclonal antibodies. Now, all of this is important because it shows Medicago had a track record, one that the government would look to when the pandemic was officially declared in March of 2020, and then in October that same year when it made a major announcement.
To begin with, our government is providing up to $173 million for Medicago to advance their vaccine candidate and create a production facility in Quebec City.
And from the company's CEO, we are proud to contribute a made-in-Canada vaccine to our country's vaccine supply, and we want to thank the Government of Canada for its confidence in Medicago. So, what does $173 million get you? Well, a big boost to research and development and to the construction of its Quebec City manufacturing facility. It was also part of a broader deal to secure 76 million doses of its vaccine, pending Health Canada approval. That would come more than a full year later. Covifenz, as the vaccine was called, was finally going to see the light of day.
Today we're here to talk to you about Health Canada's authorization of Medicago's Covifenz COVID-19 vaccine for adults 18 to 64 years of age. This is the first authorized COVID-19 vaccine developed by a Canadian company.
And make no mistake, beyond the Canadian achievement, this was heralded as a breakthrough broadly for vaccine science.
At Medicago, we use a careful step-by-step process to develop vaccines, using our plants as mini bioreactors.
The basic idea: introduce genetically modified bacteria with COVID's genetic instructions directly into the cells of a plant. When those plants grow, they produce virus-like particles that mimic the coronavirus, and they do a good enough job of it that once introduced into humans in vaccine form, they trick the immune system into recognizing it as COVID, allowing the body to develop the right antibodies to protect itself, but without any risk of actual infection. But this doesn't work with just any old plant. You remember Nicotiana benthamiana? the close cousin of the common tobacco plant. Medicago has a long history of working with it. It goes back to like 2005. But then in 2008, an actual tobacco company became interested. Now, Philip Morris is an American multinational tobacco giant, selling products in more than 180 countries worldwide, generating billions of dollars in revenue every year. When we talk about big tobacco, Philip Morris is absolutely a part of that.
Come to where the flavor is. Come to Marlboro country.
So, Philip Morris bought a large stake in Medicago for nearly $16 million. And as Medicago's fortunes rose, so did the value of Philip Morris's stock. That would become a problem.
Meanwhile, a major snag in Canada's plan to export a COVID vaccine developed in Quebec. It's the first plant-based vaccine, but as Christine Birak shows us, because there's tobacco money behind it, getting approval is tricky.
Medicago was dealt a major blow as it tried to get its product to wider markets. By this point, Canada had already been relying on Pfizer and Moderna's vaccine for more than a year. Medicago's most lucrative opportunity was likelier to be overseas, shipping vaccines abroad. But the World Health Organization decided not to accept the vaccine for emergency use because of the company's ties with, you guessed it, Philip Morris.
Experts say the vaccine's safety and efficacy isn't the problem. It's allowing a cigarette company to profit.
Now, this should not have come as a surprise. Experts we spoke to say this is a long-standing policy of the WHO to have nothing to do with an industry that kills millions of people every year, and that from Medicago's point of view, this wasn't an oversight. It was a calculated risk. But no approval meant Medicago's vaccine pipeline to the world was being choked off. It was also a blow to Canada's obligation to ship 200 million doses of vaccine to developing countries. After all, how could you share a vaccine that wasn't WHO approved? And for that matter, how could a federal government give $173 million to a company it should have known would have this problem?
We choose to invest in a company which had a plant-based vaccine which was recommended by the experts as the most promising. And you have to go, to go back 2 years ago, what we wanted to make sure to protect the health and safety of Canadians.
It should have known because Canada is actually a signatory to a legally binding agreement signed in 2005 to protect public health policies from the commercial and other vested interests of the tobacco industry.
Go back 2 years ago. When this started, you wanted to make sure that you were invested in all families of vaccine. Novavax with particle subunit, with Moderna and Pfizer with mRNA. And certainly Medicago was seen, if you go back 2 years ago, if you look at the record, people were saying that as a very promising technology, still today. That's why it was approved by Health Canada.
But even then, Canada is the only government in the world to approve Medicago's vaccine for use. And so Medicago and the federal government were both stuck between a rock and a hard place.
To every challenge, there's a solution. You've seen me before. There'll be a solution.
The solution, it turned out, would be for Medicago and Philip Morris to cut ties. Just over a month ago, Philip Morris announced it was selling its stake. At the time, it held about 21% of Medicago's stock. The sale was roundly seen as good news for the company. Free of its links to big tobacco, it would be free to reapply for World Health Organization approval. But then, late last week, a bombshell.
Medicago, a COVID-19 vaccine manufacturer with its headquarters in Quebec, its parent company has just announced it is shutting that lab down.
On Thursday, Mitsubishi Chemical Group said there have been significant changes to the vaccine market and that the vaccine, Covifenz, was being discontinued. Furthermore, the statement says, The group judged that it was not viable to continue to make further investment in the commercialization of Medicago's development products and decided to seize all of its operations at Medicago and proceed with an orderly wind-up of its business and operations. And so, just like that, a company that showed so much promise 2 years ago when it burst onto the COVID scene with a viable vaccine and a huge backbench supporter in the federal government is now almost an afterthought, buried in a press release. Now, this whole saga raises a whole bunch of different questions. I mean, there are quite a few questions about Medicago itself, right? Like what happens to all of the work that it's been doing over the past 20 plus years? But there's also a whole range of other questions about the government's involvement in all of this. Did it do its due diligence when it decided to give $173 million to the company? Well, to help us answer that question, we have joining us from our parliamentary bureau in Ottawa, Marina von Stackelberg. Hi, Marina. How are you doing?
Hey, Andrew. Good. How are you?
Good, good. Thanks for joining us. So let's start with a comment in question period. This was just from the other day from the leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre. Let's have a listen.
His investments in pharmaceuticals. He gave $170 million to a pharmaceutical operation that's shutting down.
Mr. Speaker, at the time we invested was to protect the health and safety of Canadians.
So, Marina, clearly this is a talker in Ottawa. Like, what was the government's response to this criticism?
Yeah, so since the news broke that Medicago was shutting down, this has come up quite a few times, especially with the Conservatives pushing the Liberal government on this. And, the Liberal government says, hey, we were at a time where we needed to invest in vaccine development, manufacturing, distribution, because at the time in the pandemic, it was very clear that Canada was not prepared to deal with this. And so Champagne says, hey, we are in solution mode. This is kind of what they keep saying. We're in solution mode. And what they're saying they're trying to do is find someone to take over Medicago. And they say the first priority right now is the 400 jobs that were at Medicago. Most of those are in Quebec. And they say the priority is saving those jobs. But they also want to save the manufacturing facility that they helped pay to build. And they also want to save the intellectual knowledge, the work that has been done to make sure that it just doesn't disappear.
But I guess like it still doesn't really answer the question though, right? Like did the government do its due diligence when it decided to hand over that money? Like did it know that it was going to face exactly this sort of problem down the road?
Well, it depends on who you ask, right? So they did have the issue with the World Health Organization, which said, hey, you can't be working with a tobacco company and also get approved for us for a vaccine. Should the federal government have known that this was an issue? Well, Health Canada approved the vaccine, and a month later, the WHO said, hey, no, we're not going to approve this vaccine. But, the Liberal government will say, we spent almost $2 billion to ensure that we would have this kind of infrastructure in place. And they say that even if Medicago had issues and bumps along the way, we still, set Canada up so that in the future we might be able to develop our own vaccines.
That's true. So that's a fair point, right? No matter what home the vaccines would find internationally, the federal government was reasonable to think that, well, we will have access to this, supply of homegrown vaccine. I still just can't help but wonder, knowing that it was going to have this problem, could it have gotten out ahead of it sooner than it did, right? Like to start exerting pressure, for example, on either Medicago or Philip Morris to divest its shares, just so it wouldn't be this last minute effort where a couple of months after you see the divestment of the shares, you have the company shutting down. Like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and it was interesting to see because when we saw Philip Morris divest, it kind of made people think, okay, well, maybe this vaccine can actually come to fruition. They can actually manufacture this and we can finally have this accessible to Canadians. But as I was trying to get Medicago to speak to me, it became clear to me that there was an issue. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that their vaccine was, not necessarily useful anymore because of the bivalent vaccines. And so that's kind of part of the issue for the Liberal government was they put a bunch of money into 32 different projects hoping that, one would stick. And they do have other companies that are working on vaccine development. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to know whether or not this vaccine, this money ended up being a dud.
Right.
You know, some will say that the fact that this company was able to actually get it through Health Canada approval is a good sign and kind of laid the path for future vaccine development in our country.
Hey Marina, I have 15 seconds left. Could the government get the money back? Is that possible?
So it says it has legal means, but we don't know what that is. We've asked them, hey, what exactly does that mean? Are you going to get the money back? We haven't got a good answer on that, but we'll keep pushing them for sure.
Marina von Stackelberg in Ottawa. Hey, thank you so much for this.
Take care.
And do stick around. After the break, we are going to talk about things from the Medicago point of view. We're going to take a deep dive into the work that it's done, what potential there might still be to salvage that work. Stay with us. Hey, welcome back to About That. And today we are talking about Medicago, Quebec-based biopharmaceutical company that has had many ups and downs over the last several years. The downs are perhaps what we're focusing on more. You know, we've talked about the federal government's involvement, the accountability involved there. But right now, let's talk a little bit more about the science and tech. Because let's remember, this is a pretty old company, right? It's been in existence for more than 20 years. So what's lost in a worst-case scenario where this just shuts down and disappears for good? Christine Birak, a health reporter, joining us right now to talk about that. So enlighten us. I mean, it has been working on a lot of other things, right, beyond just the COVID vaccine.
Absolutely. I think the loss here, there's a couple of significant things. Right off the bat, there's over 500 jobs that are being lost. And what's key in that is the types of jobs we're talking about. In some cases, very high-level scientists with a high degree of expertise. Not just anyone can develop vaccines. You need an idea, you need research and development, you need testing. And it takes a specialized kind of knowledge, experience, and skills to do all of that. So where are those people going to end up? Are they going to still be in Canada after Medicago shuts down?
Right.
It's really hard to say. And experts that we spoke with said, you know, listen, in this biotech field, you really need an ecosystem of people to be successful. You need the right people with the right skills, you need the technology, and you need the funding.
And how promising was the technology? Because, you know, like we talk so much about mRNA vaccines, right? And they've sort of eclipsed all other platforms when it comes to the COVID vaccine. But was there real promise in this plant-based approach that it would have been nice to see it through?
Yes, I think there was real promise there. You know, it's hard to say at this point. Medicago got this plant-based vaccine to the point where we're talking about the first plant-based COVID shot in the world. So this was technology that the world took notice of. It didn't make it to manufacturing, but there was a lot there. Getting to this stage of that technology and getting a vaccine here is critical. It's hard work. And so I think that technology now, it sits kind of frozen. We don't know what the possibilities could have been with it.
Well, can I ask you about that? Like what are the possibilities? Can the company be saved, the work, you know, unfrozen and allowed to continue somehow?
Well, I think that's the million-dollar question right now. I think the federal government says that it's all hands on deck. We're talking to CEOs of major pharmaceutical companies. They desperately want to hold on to these jobs, hold on to this technology and the intellectual property that goes with it, and keep it in Canada. And even Mitsubishi Chemical, the parent company that's pulling the plug on Medicago, said, listen, we actually commend Medicago on the innovation and the work that was done here in Canada.
Yeah, but they didn't like it enough to keep the company. Well, right? I mean, they're still shutting it down.
It's purely business decision.
Right.
You know, at the end of the day, developing vaccines is expensive. It takes a ton of money. And I think right now when we're in a pandemic, people lose sight of the fact that this is actually a very low profit margin for vaccines. The amount of money that you need to put in to come up with the concept, to do the research, to do the development, to do the testing, to do the manufacturing. And if it works, great. And if it meets a moment where it can have a payoff, great. But if it doesn't, who's paying for all this? It is not an attractive prospect, but there's a lot of possibility there. And as you mentioned, Medicago has been in business for a long time. They have established a technology. They've got this platform. Could it go somewhere? Absolutely. Does somebody want to invest in it at this point in time? Really hard to say.
Right. So what is the bigger picture here? Because I remember at the outset of the pandemic, one of the reasons, and there were a few reasons, but one of the reasons for the government to invest in a company like Medicago was to try to revitalize this biopharmaceutical industry in Canada, right? Ultimately with the goal of having a consistent, steady supply of homegrown vaccine.
Yeah.
But you don't have to depend on others, right?
Yeah, and I think that's worth remembering, because if you go back to December of 2020 when Pfizer started to roll out its vaccine, there was all this fervor about getting your hands on this vaccine.
Yeah, we weren't sure if we were going to have it.
Exactly. There's an emergency in every country. Everybody wanted these vaccines. And countries didn't behave, I think, like everybody thought they would.
Right.
So the U.S. in the Trump administration shut its borders with its vaccine. It had a Pfizer plant right across the border from Canada, and it basically said until every American who wants a shot gets a shot, these vaccines will not leave our own borders. So that left us empty-handed, even though we had paid for the vaccines. Even Pfizer wasn't happy about this.
So are we still in that kind of a sticky situation?
Well, I think that was a real wake-up call, frankly, for the Canadian government to be like, wow, we have all this expertise. But there had been this deterioration of the biotech and bioscience sector. So Medicago was sort of part of that. Medicago's plan was to get to manufacturing. And I think there is this sense out there that we need to be able to make vaccines for our own people in an emergency, and we do not have that right now. Medicago was one path to getting there. That path is now unclear, but I am hopeful that in the big picture, we will be able to manufacture vaccines in Canada for our own population, because I think we've seen at this point what happens when you can't.
Christine Birak, always good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.